Good afternoon. I'm Carol Cartwright, co-chair of the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics. In opening today's discussion, I would like to acknowledge on behalf of my Knight Commission colleagues today's National Day of Mourning in honor of George Floyd and the numerous other African-American men, women, and children who have been murdered in racially motivated incidents. It is past time for the nation to confront systemic racism, including in college sports. As a country and as a commission, there is much work to do to achieve racial equality and justice. At its best, college sports and higher education itself can be a great equalizer, one of the few arenas in American life where talent, teamwork, and discipline matter more than skin color. The Knight Commission is committed to actions that will achieve the promise of racial equality and justice. We turn now to our webinar presented by the Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics on assessing proposals to allow college athletes to earn money for the use of their name, image, and likeness. The Commission seeks to lead transformational change to prioritize athletes' education, health, safety, and success. We have a long history of work and study on this issue dating back to 2008, and we are pleased that today's session builds on our legacy of providing a public platform for thought leaders to discuss critical public policy questions facing college sports. College athletics and higher education leaders have never before faced so many challenges at one time. Going into this year, new NIL rules seem to be the most important challenge for leaders to tackle, but the COVID-19 pandemic has every leader focused on even bigger challenges this fall. Even under these extraordinary circumstances, college sports leaders are moving forward with historic changes to create a new era for college sports, one that provides even greater opportunity for college athletes than ever before. We look forward to hearing from our experts today. This is the first session that we've held virtually, so I'll go over some ground rules before turning it over to Knight Commission member Glenn Elmore, who's my partner today in facilitating this session. All attendees will be muted throughout the panel presentation. If you have a question, please click on the Q&A icon on your control panel, and you can type a question at any time. At 3:30, we will take submitted questions for our panelists and Knight Commission leaders. If we don't get to your question in this session, we will follow up after the webinar. Today's session is being recorded and will be available through a link provided by email, as well as posted on our website, knightcommission.org. Let me turn now to my colleague, Glenn Elmore.
Thank you, Carol. We all agree that there's no reason that college athletes shouldn't have the same rights as other students, especially those students who are on campus and earn compensation for the use of their name, image, and their likeness. It's time now to figure out the details so we can begin allowing these opportunities as soon as possible. Now, while there is agreement on the major issue, there are important details and differences to discuss. Before we turn to our expert panel, we want to share the Knight Commission's educational video on NIL issues, which is narrated by one of our members, the esteemed David Robinson, and another former college sports star, Elizabeth Beisel. Now, after the video, I'll turn it over to two of our members who co-chaired the Commission's committee charged with developing recommendations. Christine Copper, Faculty Athletics Representative at the U.S. Naval Academy, and Walt Harrison, President Emeritus, University of Hartford. So right now, let's watch the video.
I'm Elizabeth Beisel, and I'm grateful for my experiences as a college athlete and as a 3-time Olympian.
I'm David Robinson, and the opportunity to play basketball at the United States Naval Academy shaped my life in many ways. Today, intercollegiate sports require major changes to our unique American model for college athletes. Those changes must prioritize the fair treatment of college athletes in their education, health, safety, and success.
One of the significant changes being considered is allowing college athletes to earn compensation for the use of their name, image, and likeness, commonly referred to as NIL. Changes to NIL rules could allow college athletes to earn pay for endorsement deals, like being a social media influencer on Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram, or for signing autographs. We will explore key issues surrounding NIL rights and discuss how rule changes might work for athletes, universities, and college sports overall.
Let's start with the basics. NIL rights are not unique to college athletes. Generally speaking, every individual has a right to earn pay for the use of his or her name, image, or likeness. That is more commonly called a person's right of publicity. However, in most circumstances, NCAA rules prohibit college athletes from earning money for the use of their NIL.
The fundamental principle underlying this prohibition is amateurism. Amateurism means that college athletes do not receive payments for playing their sport in excess of their education-related expenses. College athletes must also be full-time students in good academic standing. These two core components of the college sports model, amateurism rules and the academic eligibility requirements, are designed to maintain the priority of education, promote fair competition among schools, and distinguish college sports from pro sports. Amateurism in college sports has evolved. A century ago, athletic scholarships were banned because they were viewed as pay for play. Athletic scholarships were eventually permitted, and now schools can provide additional financial support to college athletes to cover other costs of attendance, but only as long as those benefits are tied to educational costs. Now, with college athletes poised to earn compensation for the use of their NIL, we're seeing another evolution in amateurism rules. But the compensation must come from sources other than the school to maintain the prohibition against pay for play.
The Knight Commission on Intercollegiate Athletics believes 5 principles should guide the development of these new rules in an updated model of college sports. First, prioritize fairness to athletes as students. Second, inform and educate athletes on NIL rights and restrictions. Third, require independent oversight. That oversight should be led by a majority independent board, which includes current and former college athletes. Fourth, create guardrails against pay for play, impermissible benefits, and recruiting abuses. And finally, make NIL rules uniform and enforceable across all states.
Okay, Christine, I think you and Walt, it's your turn.
Yes, I'm Walt Harrison, and I think wisely they've decided not to show you my picture. We'd like to thank Elizabeth Beisel and David Robinson for framing the NIL conversation and for introducing the Knight Commission principles for new rules on the use of college athletes' name, image, and likeness. There I am. As was mentioned, the principles are designed to ensure the fair treatment of college athletes and to better prioritize their education, health, safety, and success while ensuring that the NIL opportunities do not become forms of pay for play or create improper recruiting advantages. Principle number 1, fairness to athletes as students. The Knight Commission recommends that college athletes are permitted to pursue NIL opportunities like other students, while recognizing there needs to be guardrails to ensure that those opportunities do not become pay for play or create a recruiting advantage. College athletes should be permitted to use third-party professionals who are not affiliated with the university to arrange NIL opportunities. Principle number 2, informing athletes on NIL rights. Institutions must provide education on NIL rights, including related legal and regulatory issues, and the uses and restrictions of third-party professionals.
Principle number 3, in oversight of NIL rights. The Knight Commission recommends that the oversight body for the management and application of NIL rules must be comprised of a majority of independent directors who are not employed by the NCAA or its members and have at least 1/3 current and former college athletes. Principle number 4, guardrails for NIL rights. NIL rules must ensure fair competition among institutions and permit only legitimate NIL transactions. Rules must be designed to protect against improper recruiting or retention arrangements and must avoid becoming pay for play. Specifically, conferences, institutions, and their employees and independent contractors must be barred from providing or arranging for NIL compensation to college athletes or prospective college athletes, including group licensing deals. NIL arrangements must be broadly consistent with fair market value, and college athletes may not be permitted to use institutional or conference marks or logos. Principle number 5, national uniformity. NIL rules must be uniform and enforceable across all states. The Knight Commission is pleased to see significant critical debate happening in an effort to advance the NCAA towards an NIL model that will provide college athletes access to compensation in an updated model for college sports. We reaffirm that this model must maintain the 2 foundational elements that distinguish college sports from professional sports. College athletes must be full-time academically eligible students, and institutions must be prohibited from paying them for their athletics participation. There are certainly many details left to be worked out over the next few months, and we hope that today's discussion will help advance that conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Christine and Walt, and thanks to your committee members as well for their leadership. Note, everyone, that all those members of the committee plus Christine and Walt will be available to answer questions in the Q&A portion of this session. Now, our first expert is Gabe Feldman. Gabe will provide a brief overview to frame the key issues for our panelists. As most of you know, Gabe is director of Tulane's sports law program. And in 2016, he wrote a paper for our group outlining how an NIL model might work for college sports. Now, after Gabe's remarks, we'll ask each panelist to highlight the work in which they've been involved in on this issue. So to further introduce our panelists, let's begin with Val Ackerman, my good friend who has served as a co-chair for the NCAA's federal and state legislation working group, which focused on creating the NCAA's NIL proposal, and you also know that she is a commissioner of the Big East. Tom McMillen, my former teammate and my longtime friend, is president and CEO of Lead One and will provide the athletics director's viewpoints. And we have Congressman Anthony Gonzalez, who played college football at the Ohio State University, and he will share his perspective on the possible national legislation. So to begin, Gabe, you're on.
Thank you, Len, and thank you to Walt and Christine for your leadership in this area. And I just want to start my comments by saying I'm typically not the best athlete on a panel in the room, but I feel really inadequate with this group of panelists. But let me jump right in to the conversation before turning it over to Val and Tom and Representative Gonzalez. And I want to discuss 3 general points The first is a quick comparison of the models that have been presented, both by the Knight Commission that you just heard explained, but also a bit from Lead 1 and the NCAA report and some of the other models that are out there. Then 2, talk about one of the specific issues that has been raised around group licensing. And then 3, talk a little bit about the uniformity issue and some of the possibilities there. And let me just start the overall remarks here by noting the flurry of activity that's gone on in this area. As I think most people are aware, 37 states have either passed or proposed legislation that would cover name, image, and likeness. There's been activity at the federal level, and then obviously from the NCAA, from the Knight Commission, from Lead 1, from the Autonomy 5 commissioners, and many other groups of influence. So there's a lot to discuss. There's been a lot discussed, and I think there's been a very healthy debate about how to move forward with name, image, and likeness. And as Len said, the conversation appears to have shifted from whether we should allow this or whether universities should allow this to how we should allow it. So let me talk a bit about the differences in the proposals and some of the commonalities. And I want to reemphasize some points that Christine and Walt made from the Knight Commission proposal, and because I think it helps understand how all the details flow from these initial principles. And the basic tenets that I think are common to the Knight Commission, to the NCAA report, to Lead 1, to really almost all who have spoken in this area, is a concern that while we do want to allow college athletes to receive compensation for their name, image, and likeness, like all other non-athlete students on campus, that there are some particular concerns that are raised around college athletics that aren't raised around the non-athlete student body. And people can disagree about the weight of these concerns and how they should be balanced against the right of the college athletes to receive compensation. But I just want to reemphasize the primary concerns. And one, as we've heard, is avoiding turning this system into a pay for performance or pay for play system. That the NCAA has made clear, and again, I understand people might disagree with this point, but the NCAA has made clear and the Knight Commission has made clear that they believe in the model that distinguishes pro sports from college sports. And that in college sports, the athletes do not receive compensation for their performance above and beyond their educational expenses. And the other is to create a system that does not provide for additional unfair recruiting advantages or inducements. So to avoid having name, image, and likeness payments being used to recruit an athlete to attend a particular school. And I think if you think about those two concepts, plus the concept of providing more economic rights to college athletes, then everything flows from that. You can bring it back to, well, why is this recommendation here? It ties back to one of those points. So let me just highlight a couple of the key points again that Walt and Christine and that video raised, and compare them a little bit with what the NCAA has proposed in Lead 1. But I'm going to defer, obviously, the details of the NCAA report to Val and Lead 1 to Tom. But a key commonality is the lack of institutional involvement. The idea that we need to keep the colleges and, from the Knight Commission's perspective, the conferences out of these deals, out of compensating the athletes directly for their name, image, and likeness, and also from facilitating or arranging these deals. Because if the institutions are involved, the fear is, again, that this will turn into a pay-for-play system and it will turn into a recruiting inducement. And along those lines, the Knight Commission and the NCAA have both proposed prohibiting the use of institutional marks or conference marks in any NIL deal. That a college athlete can use their name, image, and likeness to receive compensation, but cannot, even with permission from the institution, they cannot use the institution's mark in their name, image, and likeness deal. Because if they are using the institution's mark, then again, the fear is that will blend into or blur the line between pay for play, pay to attend the institution, which would be prohibited, and pay for their name, image, and likeness, which would be allowed under these proposals. Another commonality is the understanding that there will need to be some representation of the college athletes in these NIL deals, and some third-party professionals that can represent them, and some oversight and regulation of those third-party professionals to protect the interest of the college athletes. One of the areas where there is potentially some difference in the Knight Commission proposal and the NCAA report is this idea that was mentioned earlier of independent oversight. And it is a key principle of the Knight Commission that there be independent oversight of the NIL process. And there's lots of different ways that can be accomplished, and Christine and Walt went through it, so I won't repeat it here. But I think there's some difference there, and Val can talk about the potential role of an independent group in operationalizing an NIL policy, but not necessarily overseeing or helping create the policy. And then there are some potential differences in terms of restrictions on third parties who would be allowed to be engaged in these NIL deals with college athletes. The Knight Commission doesn't specify, but we want to make sure that these are legitimate deals. And these are legitimate deals, not deals that are used, again, as recruiting inducements or to pay the athlete to attend or play at a particular institution. The NCAA has suggested potentially specific restrictions, whether it's on third parties who may have a conflict in terms of their image compared to the institution or the product they're selling, such as alcohol or gambling, or if it's a booster, that the involvement of boosters may heighten the concerns of pay for play or recruiting inducements. Again, the Knight Commission, I think, handles that more broadly by saying those are concerns we have with all groups, not just with boosters. And then the last point I'll mention in terms of the overall comparison is this idea of guardrails, a term that you've heard mentioned many times. And I think there's general agreement that some parameters need to be put in place, again, to make sure that these are legitimate transactions, legitimate money paid for a name, image, and likeness deal, not for some other purpose. And the Knight Commission has suggested that fair market value be at least a factor to consider to try to make sure that these are legitimate deals. And again, Val and Tom can talk more about the specifics of the NCAA and lead one in that respect. And the last thing I'll just note in terms of the overall comparison, and it's something that the NCAA points out in their report, something the Knight Commission points out in their principles, and something Lead One, the Autonomy 5 have talked about. Let me actually say two things. One is the importance of education and protecting the education of these college athletes. The Autonomy 5 commissioners have a specific proposal there to not permit NIL deals until a college athlete has completed one semester of academic progress, to try to, one, enforce the primacy of education, and two, to try to keep boosters out. But the other point I want to mention that is important, and I think will answer some of the questions that I see appearing in the chat, is that most of the details still need to be worked out. These are broad principles, and there are lots of different ways to achieve these broad principles, and there's a lot of discussion to still be had to try to accomplish the principles. So I will just say, as a general matter, how do we do all of these things? I think the Knight Commission has said we need to figure that out, we need to operationalize it, but this is the broad framework that we think protects college athletes, provides them more opportunity, but also protects college sports. So now let me shift to topic number 2, which has received a lot of attention, and that's group licensing. And group licensing is something that is touched on, at least in some capacity, in most of the proposals that are out there. And I will just take 10 seconds to talk about the general group licensing model, and I'm going to oversimplify this, but a lot of people have looked to the professional leagues and players associations and say, there is a model that exists, just adopt their model. And a challenge with that, among many other challenges, as the NCAA working group has noted in its report, is that the professional athletes in, let's say, the NFL or the NBA are represented by a union, and a union negotiates the group licensing rights for those athletes. And there obviously is no union in place in college sports. There's also, in professional sports, you can say there's a more readily identifiable group that would be negotiated on behalf. So you have all NFL players that are part of the Players Union or part of the NFL Players Association. there's some question about what the group would be within college athletics. Would it be all football players at a particular institution, all athletes? Would it just be FBS football players? So again, there are answers to some of these questions, but there are differences between the pro model and the college model, obviously. And then let me just talk a little bit about what the group licensing generally looks like and accomplishes, and why there is some heightened concern about adopting that model at the collegiate level. And the reason, or part of the reason why you would have a group licensing deal at the professional level, is from the third party's perspective. If you want to have, let's say, a video game or a trading card set that features all of the players, it's much more efficient to get a group deal that has the rights to use all of the players rather than negotiate with each one of them individually. So it's more efficient to have a group deal. From the player perspective, there are many players that don't have a lot or necessarily any value in their name, image, and likeness by themselves. Their value comes primarily, if not exclusively, from their membership of the team or the league. And so they are able to get compensation because they're part of this broader group. And that group, again, whether it is a team or entire league that would be in a video game or a trading card set, people want to pay to have all of those players. And so all of the athletes stand to benefit because they're part of that broader group. From the Knight Commission's perspective, the prohibition on group licensing just falls under the broader umbrella of trying to protect against any NIL model turning into pay for play or recruiting inducements. So the Knight Commission principles would not permit group licensing if the institution or the conference is involved and either paying for that group license or arranging for it, or if the marks are used. Right? So you couldn't do a deal if you're a group of football players at an institution that's been arranged by the institution, paid for by the institution, or that uses the marks. But you could, under the Knight Commission principles, be a group of football players at an institution and get together with that group and pool your NIL rights, license them to a third party, as long as you're not using the marks. So you can do a group deal. You just can't do a group deal with institutional involvement or with the marks and logos of the institution or the conference. The last point I'll make about the Knight Commission on that issue is that the Knight Commission is generally in favor and would generally recommend or look as a possible solution for group licensing to do a national deal that would permit a video game, where that national deal would involve all of the institutions and their marks and logos and all of the college athletes. Because if it's at the national level, then you eliminate or minimize some of those pay-for-play concerns where a college athlete would choose to go to a particular institution because they can offer them a better group licensing deal. If all of the schools are offering it and all the athletes can share in it, then those concerns are somewhat reduced. From the NCAA's perspective, and again, I will defer to Val on the specifics of this, they have additional concerns, and Val can speak to them, that I think would be more broadly prohibitive of group licensing deals. But I just wanted to clarify at least the Knight Commission's perspective on that and why that is their perspective. And the last point I want to make in my last minute here is just on the importance of uniformity. And I think there's a recognition by most in this space that uniform rules are important to sports in general and college athletics in particular. The idea of having a relatively level playing field or rules that everybody can generally work under. And there's lots of different discussions about how to achieve uniformity. And there is certainly talk of having a federal law to achieve uniformity. What I just want to suggest very quickly in my last 30 seconds is I'm the reporter for the Uniform Law Commission that is about to recommend legislation on a uniform level across states. So it would be a uniform state law. And the discussion is now advancing to whether the Uniform Law Commission and the 50 states can work with Congress cooperatively to create both a federal framework that would provide certain protections and minimums, but also allow the states to then put additional restrictions or protections in place to give uniformity, but also to give flexibility, to allow Congress to speak, but also allow the states to be involved to try to put in rules, again, to provide more rights for college athletes, but also to protect college athletics in general. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Lynn.
Thank you, Gabe, for framing the issues extraordinarily well. Let's now hear from our panelists. Let's begin with Val Ackerman, who, as I mentioned, co-chaired the NCAA's NIL proposal. And from Val, we'll go to Tom McMillen, and then finally with Congressman Gonzalez. So Val, it's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Len. I have enormous respect for the Commission's longstanding efforts and the Knight Foundation's longstanding commitment to your work, especially after being in your inner circle during my 12 years of service on this body. And so it's truly a privilege for me to be here today and to be reunited, albeit virtually, with many friends and colleagues. Last May, Gene Smith, the athletics director at The Ohio State University, and I were appointed co-chairs of a 20-person NCAA working group formed to review the association's longstanding rules regarding the use of student-athlete names, images, and likenesses. Our 20-person working group spanned the NCAA's 3 divisions, and it included 3 student-athletes, all of whom brought vital perspectives to our analysis. I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Knight Commission, Gabe, Tom, and others who provided valuable feedback and insights as we were conducting our review. And I want to thank Representative Gonzalez for his interest in this important subject. Our final working group report, which was delivered to the NCAA's Board of Governors on April 28th, reflects many hours of deliberation and our best judgment about how best to meld the interests and the needs of college athletes today with the attributes of a competition system that is unlike any in the sports world. As a former student athlete at the University of Virginia, which I attended in the early days of Title IX as one of the school's first female scholarship recipients, I can attest to the unique ways that college sports prepare young men and young women for the rigors of adulthood. Today, investment by NCAA schools in the student athlete experience amounts to more than $3.5 billion annually in scholarship support alone, and has opened doors for millions of young people to earn degrees and pursue their dreams, in many cases, like my own, debt-free. But times have changed since my playing days at UVA, and Gene, I, and our working group believe that college sports, like other institutions in American life, should embrace the opportunity to keep in step with our ever-changing times. A meaningful way to do that is with a modernized NIL model. From the outset, our working group was guided by certain core principles. First, we're committed to a system that features students competing against students, and not one in which athletes are employees who are paid salaries by their schools. Second, we recognize that commercial opportunities funded by third parties now flow to many non-athlete students on college campuses, particularly in the area of social media, and we believe that similar doors should be open to athletes to the greatest degree possible. Third, we believe the NCAA NIL model must account for the core attribute that distinguishes college sports, especially in Division I, from other elite sports outlets like professional sports and the Olympics. Our schools recruit. Unlike pro sports leagues where players are assigned to teams through the draft, or the Olympics where one's national team is determined by his or her passport, college athletes can freely choose which school to attend. It's therefore critical to our system of athlete procurement that we maintain some level of integrity and fairness, and that we mitigate the potentially harmful involvement of boosters and other overzealous individuals who would use NIL opportunities as an improper inducement in both the recruiting and transfer environments. This concern is especially acute in high-profile sports like football and basketball. Finally, we want to make sure that foundational NCAA values like academic achievement and degree completion, which the Knight Commission has long championed, are safeguarded in the new model. With these principles in mind, our working group developed an NIL framework that will offer student athletes a groundbreaking new set of ways to earn outside income from third parties. Importantly, the leadership in college sports today has prioritized diversity, inclusion, and equity in the management of our programs, and we believe the wave of potential new benefits available to all of our student athletes under the new model, including women and athletes of color, will only strengthen our efforts to that end. And these efforts are more important than ever today. Over the coming months, representatives from our schools and conferences will iron out the details of NIL legislation, which will include guardrails to address concerns about pay for play and recruiting integrity, and the myriad of implementation challenges that will be associated with this model. A full vote on the legislation will be taken at the next NCAA convention in January, with a planned effective date starting with the 2021-22 academic year. The NCAA NIL model will allow two primary categories of NIL use: in student-athlete work product or business activities, and to endorse third-party products or services. The types of NIL activities that would be permitted with regulation under the new rules would include startup businesses, other entrepreneurial undertakings, book, TV, film, and music endeavors, modeling, lessons for a fee, camps and clinics, speeches and personal appearances, and social media influencer arrangements. To avoid pay-for-play implications, schools would not be allowed to develop, operate, or promote NIL activities, and no school intellectual property could be used. Booster involvement would also be restricted. We are still considering how best to manage potential NIL conflicts with existing school sponsor relationships, including footwear and apparel companies, which have a long history of involvement with recruiting, and with products and services at odds with college sports values, like banned substances and sports wagering entities. Under the NCAA model, student athletes would be required to annually disclose their NIL arrangements and would be allowed to hire third-party professional service providers for guidance, such as financial and tax advisors, lawyers, and brand managers, likely subject to some level of regulation to help limit the influence of bad actors. Schools would also be called upon to provide baseline educational programming to help student athletes navigate the many complexities associated with NIL transactions, including contract basics, personal brand management practices, income tax filing requirements, and disclosure obligations. I'll note that some outside groups, including the Knight Commission, have proposed the formation of a third-party entity to manage some elements of NIL administration, in part to help relieve the burden that campus compliance personnel may face attempting to monitor these newly permitted activities. Our working group believes this idea indeed has merit, and it's currently being explored. We've been following closely the interests of federal and state lawmakers in NCAA NIL and believe a patchwork approach where each state potentially has a different set of rules would make it difficult, if not impossible, to conduct intercollegiate athletics on a national level. Our recommendations therefore include a proposed template for congressional intervention to ensure uniform national NIL law, safeguard the non-employment status of student athletes, and provide a safe harbor that would allow the NCAA to enact and enforce NIL rules without the threat of continuing litigation. I'd like to acknowledge former Knight Commission member and Georgetown president Jack DeGioia, who chaired a subgroup of university presidents that led the development of the congressional action template. Finally, building off Gabe's comments, our working group determined for now that group licenses, which would combine school trademarks with student athlete NIL and licensed products common in professional sports, like video games, replica jerseys, and trading card collections, are unworkable in college sports, largely because of the absence of a recognized bargaining agent to manage the terms of group NIL use on behalf of the student athletes. Under our model, these sorts of products could be undertaken by athletes without institutional intellectual property. But to the extent school involvement is sought, we believe this is another area that may be suitable for congressional intervention. Much is changing at this moment in our country and in our world. We believe the absence of sports competitions during the COVID-19 pandemic only reaffirms their importance, and we hope that the new NCAA NIL model will lead to an even more robust experience for our athletes, the leaders of tomorrow, when college sports resume center stage. Thanks so much, Len. I'll turn things back over to you.
Tom?
Someone has to allow me back into the video. One second. There we go. For some reason, it's not allowing me back into the video. That the host has to
We can hear you, though.
allow me back in. You can hear me. So
Yeah.
I don't know why the video is not, but I can begin. And again, thank the Knight Commission for the invitation to be a part of this. Having been a Knight Commission member back in the inaugural Knight Commission for over a decade, I really value the work that the Knight Commission does, and we're happy to be a part of it. My job today is to explain really where our ADs are on this issue. We just completed a survey of 102 schools, about 80% out of our 130 schools. The representation was about 50% Power 5, 50% Group of 5, and I hope that it is representative and can be useful in this discussion. I think it's very important to hear our AD's voice because they actually run these programs. They deal with the issues day to day, and they are closest to the problems when they do occur. I might add that some of our ADs in our survey were very much opposed to the liberalization of NIL rules, but that is a minority at this point in time. So with that, I'm going to go through the various categories that we surveyed, and then we can look forward to questions. When it came down to the big issue of guardrails, there was almost a unanimous opinion amongst our ADs that there should be guardrails with any type of NIL system. So start there. The first major category we polled on was the use of an independent third-party administrator to provide oversight and transparency. And nearly 3/4 of our ADs supported that third-party oversight. And that was also part of our recommendation, Lead One's recommendation to the NCAA's working group. Two major concerns, I think, because of why they support this. One is, in our poll, we found out that Title IX concerns were very, very high. 9 out of 10 of our ADs surveyed felt the present proposal could have some Title IX implications. So that's one reason why they supported a third party. The second part of it was they have a very high level concern that college sports could not effectively monitor and regulate an NIL system. Again, having a third party could make that more feasible. And obviously transparency, our AD supported the process of full transparency, which would be provided by a third party administrator. When we went to the next category of group licensing, 63% of our ADs were in support of it if the legal concerns could be alleviated. We had obvious comments about unionization and some of the concerns there, but overall, our ADs were supportive of, group licensing if the legal concerns could be addressed. When we turn to institutional involvement, as Val referenced, all of our ADs, and we had a webinar yesterday and discussed this, all of our ADs were very much in favor of the educational program part of it, but are concerned about some of the compliance and evaluation aspects. Helping a student athlete evaluate an opportunity or even evaluate a professional service provider, there was concern expressed in that area. When we asked about whether our student athletes should have the right to enter into a license agreement with their institution, again, surveying institutional involvement for the commercial use of the institution's logo and trademarks. For instance, signing a licensing agreement like any other vendor with the school. A majority of our ADs felt that they should not have that right. And so that was an interesting result as well of the survey. When we turn to conflicts in our survey, majority believe that the student athlete should not be allowed to do deals with exclusive partners of the school. For example, if you're a Nike school, a student athlete shouldn't go and do a deal with an Under Armour. Under Armour, for example. 80% of our ADs felt very strongly about that. When it got to other categories, let's say non-exclusive deals, like for automobile dealerships, let's say athletic department had deals with 10 auto dealers. Even then, 60% of our ADs felt that the student athlete should not be allowed to enter into those deals. So in summary, the conflict provision is of a great concern. The comments that we received were that this could result in displacement of income and dramatically hurt the programs. Finally, when it came to multimedia rights holders should be permitted to engage the student athlete these days in these kind of deals, again, a minority of our ADs supported that. So the majority did not feel that the multimedia rights provider should be involved in that. When we turn to limits, what kind of limits should be placed on student athletes? The majority felt that there should be no limits on time or appearances, both on time or appearances. So limits is obviously not a concern of our athletic directors. When you turn to professional service providers, a minority of our ADs felt the NCAA should continue to limit the involvement of professional service providers. They did not, my takeaway from this area is that this was not a high level concern of most of our ADs. One area that was of concern is pre-enrollment regulation. How do you regulate a student athlete before they enroll in the university with respect to NIL deals? And a slight majority felt that there should be pre-enrollment regulation aligning with pre-enrollment with the regulation under the NIL legislation, but that's only a very slight majority. This is a very tricky issue for our ADs because the majority of them do not believe that the system will be able to monitor pre-enrollment deals. So while they say that there should be pre-enrollment regulation, they don't believe that this kind of monitoring will be effective. Turning to consequences as another category, clearly the number one consequence that our schools are concerned about is recruiting abuse, almost 83%. And that's been presented by Gabe and Val. Booster involvement in inducements and impermissible benefits, about 66%. And exploitation of a student athlete by a third party was about 40%. So those are the three categories. The last one was interesting, given the fact that we didn't see great concern on the professional service provider, but obviously that is one of their concerns as a consequence. An interesting perspective from the survey was that 71% of our ADs felt that very few student athletes would stand to profit from this NIL implementation, and that 71%, although we have heard in our webinar yesterday of others that believe, as Val said, that this could open up opportunities for many Olympic sports and so forth. But amongst our ADs, they still believe it's fairly narrow in terms of application. One important issue that came up was the difference between smaller resource schools and larger resource schools and the consequences therein. 70% felt it would make it more difficult for smaller resource schools to compete against larger schools because of an NIL system. And finally, enforcement. I think this is probably one of the most important. I think I'm sure one of the ones that Val struggled with. 85% of our ADs were not confident or not confident at all that college sports has the ability to effectively and fairly monitor, investigate issues, and ensure accountability if NIL becomes reality. So let me just summarize the high points of this survey. Third parties strongly are favored. A third party oversight is strongly favored by our ADs. Group licensing is okay, supported if legal issues can be handled. They want to see very limited institutional involvement. Education is certainly one of the areas there they agree should be part of it. They're very, very concerned about conflicts with their own institution sponsors. They don't want logos and trademarks of institutions used. They want no limits on the student athlete money, in terms of money or time. They're very concerned about pre-enrollment regulation. They're highly concerned about recruiting abuses. They believe the Power Five, Group of Five divide will be exacerbated. And finally, on enforcement, they are concerned, highly concerned, that the system will not be able to enforce with accountability this NIL regime. That's my report. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present.
Okay, now we have the honor of Representative Anthony Gonzalez. Sir.
Hello. First off, thank you to the Knight Commission for having me as a part of this important panel. And obviously a big thank you for all the work that you all do on college athletics in general. My remarks will be fairly brief. I think everybody sort of hit on the highlights, but I'll give you sort of an overview of the legislation that we're working on, which we hope to drop within the next month, if not sooner, and then highlight some of the areas that we think there's still some questions. And a lot of this sounds like we're actually all pretty much on the same page here. As an opener, the one thing that we wanted to do from the beginning was make sure that we are protecting the college athletic system that we all know and love. I consider myself to be incredibly blessed to have played at Ohio State. It's one of the most formative experiences of my life. And frankly, when we look across the country and we see the tragedy with George Floyd and the unrest in our communities, the rightful indignation with race relations, and still to this very day, I lean on my college athletic and my professional athletic experiences and those relationships that I've built with members of all communities in the country. I tell people I have a great educational background. I went to Ohio State, got my MBA at Stanford University, both great schools, and eternally grateful. It's actually what I learned in those locker rooms that I believe is probably the most important set of educational experiences. And so we need to protect this system. We need to make sure that whatever we do preserves the opportunity for athletes, whether you're in football, basketball, lacrosse, swimming. My wife is a college swimmer. No matter what your path, the college athletic system has value, and it's an enormous value. And frankly, it's one that I hope everybody has opportunities to participate in if that's their path. So that's number one. Number two, I have believed since I was a college athlete that name, image, and likeness is a fundamental, basic economic right that every American should have. Oddly, if you're a politician, you have it. You could write a book and you could capitalize on your name, image, and likeness, but college athletes do not. And that's never made sense to me. So we wanted to grant that economic right. Additionally, we believe that a federal law is what's appropriate to preempt all the state-by-state chaos we all know doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to have a high school student looking at different state legislatures and saying, okay, I like Florida's law better than Oklahoma's law, and so maybe I'll go to the University of Miami. That wouldn't make any sense. And so we think having a federal law is critical, and that'll be a part. We also are going to be clear that the student athletes are students and not employees. I personally believe that the college sports model that we all know and love breaks in an employment world. I do not think employment is the right path, but I do think certainly name, image, and likeness. And so we make explicit that the student athletes are not employees. Obviously, we have guardrails around recruitment and making sure that the recruiting space and the transfer portal is not polluted by name, image, and likeness. You could see where that could happen, certainly. And so our bill will be sensitive to that and have federal penalties for those who break those rules. And so I think that's one way that we've put teeth into the bill to say, hey, look, I think this right is absolute. People should have it. But if there are bad actors who are getting involved in literal paying to play, I'll give you $50,000 to come to XYZ school. I think that's something that we should all push back against. And so that will be there. And then finally, and we're still candidly in the idea phase on this, but I think it echoes some of the concerns I've heard. We believe that there should be independent oversight of the process. There's a lot of unanswered questions in the NCAA's report. That's not a criticism. I think they would admit that. But the place where I think a lot of that can be answered is inside of sort of an independent oversight body that provides reports to Congress. I don't believe you want the federal government doing this, but I do believe that we should have periodic reports that detail how this is playing out, and then it be independently managed in a way that grants student athletes the correct amount of representation, but also is sensitive to the fact that there are a lot of people with different perspectives on this, both from the athletic world, from the business world, certainly from the university space. And so we want to create an environment where diverse voices can be heard, and the representation makes sense. So that's sort of broad brushstrokes of what we're working on. Happy to answer any questions on it as we go forward. But again, just a big thank you. Final piece, I guess, before I sign off. The one thing, you'll see other proposals come out of Congress. A couple things that'll make ours different. One, from day one, we've wanted to be bipartisan and bicameral. As Tom will tell you, you can waste a lot of time in Washington by just working with your own party, and that doesn't make sense to me. And so we've been coordinating with our Senate colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, as well as the House, and I think we've built up a good cadre of members who are just waiting for the bill. Frankly, they've said, "Hey, I trust the work you're doing. Just let me know when you're ready," and I think that'll be very soon. So that's where we're at. Thank you again for having me, and I will yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. We do have questions to be asked. We have questions from our commission members before we take questions that may be submitted by the audience through the Q&A icon. First, let me ask the panelists, leave your cameras open so that obviously we can not only hear you, but see your reactions, etc. But so when we begin the questioning, I'll start by asking probably a general universal question is essentially, what do you see as the biggest challenge to implementing the NIL model?
Is that for me or who's that one?
Actually it's for all of the panelists. Sorry.
Okay. Sure. I'll if it's okay, I'll start. I can. This one's quick. Congress is a very divisive place, certainly, but one that has a lot of competing interests and ideas, not only on this issue but on many others. So the biggest challenge for me is just making sure that legislatively we're building coalitions in a smart way, and we're doing it sort of as we go. I don't want to spring a bill on everybody at the very end and say, hey, here's the answer, but more kind of educating and leading from the bottom, if you will, as we move along. So that's the biggest challenge, though, by far, is just making sure that we can build a sizable enough coalition on the legislation.
Hey, Len, I'll try this from what I can see from the association side. As the depth of these comments shows, there are a myriad of issues, many to be worked out, ironed out. As Representative Gonzalez and former Representative McMillen know, the NCAA is not a small bureaucracy, it's a large one. And so there are challenges there that will exist in the coming months as we work to, again, iron out these details, forge the consensus, which I'm confident will be there, about the details, all in time, to come up with a model that's able to be implemented in a year's time. We've got many people at the association now involved. There's a separate working group that was formed after we delivered our report. We handed off to a legislative solutions group chaired by Bob Bowlesby and Grace Calhoun. Grace chairs the council. The council will be involved. Each one of the 3 divisions is examining its own NIL frameworks and may have likely mostly the same, but some differences. But again, working out all these details and getting to the bottom of the rabbit holes that exist every time you sort of take one of these on and think about it deeply, I think will be a challenge. I believe we're up to it, and we look forward to the continued input of many as we work it out. But there's clearly a lot of work to be done. And so while I think we pushed the ball forward with the report that we delivered in April, everyone involved is very cognizant of the work that remains.
Tom?
And Lenny, I would say that to get the bill passed, as the congressman said, it's always a challenge, and particularly when you're trying to put a guardrail model in place when most of the state bills have very few guardrails, and so that disconnect will be a challenge to get it implemented, given all the different factions around college sports. As far as the actually implementing, if we do get it all through the process, I think the biggest concern our ADs have is that 85% of them don't believe the system will be able to regulate it. And we've got to give assurance that this can be done in a way that just doesn't get out of control, turn into poor play, or lead to more scandal and abuse in college sports. Our institutions of higher education cannot stand that and do not want that to happen. So I think those are the 2 issues.
All right, great. Now for my commission members, in the order of the next several questions, we've got Kendall Spencer, Jill Pilgrim, Jacques McClendon, Christine Copper, and Walt Harrison. So Kendall, why don't you?
Yeah, so thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Tom, your comment about pay for play leads perfectly into my next question, and I guess we'll start with Val on this. With all of these concerns, especially from the ADs and the greater public, can you talk about some of the factors that are going to need to be in place to really keep this from becoming a pay for play situation?
Well, I think the principal one, Kendall, is the separation between the university and the endeavor. The notion here, as Representative Gonzalez noted, would be that the athletes have names, images, and likenesses. This model would allow them to exploit those NILs commercially, but there's nothing that says that the school has to be involved with that. It truly is designed to be separate. And so, as we look at it, that's a key pillar. To keep this from being income from third parties that would inure to the benefit of the athletes, but would allow the schools to continue to provide what they've been providing as part of the student athlete experience, which is scholarship, cost of attendance, and other permissible benefits. The other, I would note, because one of the panelists, I think, brought up Title IX. That's another important consideration, I'd say, in the implementation of the system. And to the extent that the institution is separated from the activity, at least it was the view of our working group and council advising us, that put us in a better position to make sure that the principles of Title IX were maintained. The notion would be that the institution would provide some level of assistance and services to aid the athletes as they navigate the marketplace. But when it comes to the opportunities, that really, frankly, is the marketplace deciding where it wants to divest its dollars. So again, I think the key point will be separating the institution from the endeavor. That's probably would be the lead requirement in order to keep this concern at bay.
Representative Gonzalez, you guys want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you sort of how we're approaching it. Frankly, I say this with every bill we work on. I'm never going to have as much information as Val or Gene Smith, who Ohio State's athletic director, or the university presidents with respect to what the specific challenges on implementation are. And so the way that we're focusing on it, and this is why we've sort of moved into this independent oversight board, if you will. Clearinghouse is kind of a loaded word, and it just means something different in the NCAA world, but that's sort of what we have in mind. And the reason we've moved in that direction is because of the feedback we've gotten on needing it to be more than arm's length, to make sure that you don't get into the pay-for-play world. And frankly, that the system can evolve. I think the odds that we get it right straight out of the gate are basically zero. And so I think you need, I say that humbly and honestly, but so you need some flex in there a little bit. And I think having an independent body of experts that can work on this specifically and make this kind of their day-to-day can have a positive impact. But that's sort of how we're looking at it. We're looking to the institutions, to the situation, people who are in it day-to-day to say, hey, here's what we need. And here's sort of what we're concerned with. And then we can build that sort of on the back end through the legislation and give you all the opportunity to run it, essentially.
And I would agree with the congressman. I think that third-party independent oversight is extremely important. And real-time disclosure. Sunlight is the great disinfectant. We have real-time disclosure at the end of political campaigns with the Federal Election Commission. We have real-time disclosure at the SEC with the Edgar system, but it doesn't work perfectly. There's still underground money, and there's still fraud and abuse in our securities exchange world. It will not solve all the problems, but it'll give us a lot of tools to weed out bad actors and the kinds of abuses that we don't want to have occur in college sports.
Okay, next up, Jill Pilgrim.
So thank you, panel, for your very enlightening comments. And my question is for Tom and Val, and it speaks to an area of sports that I've been most involved in and am most interested in, which is the Olympic, or what you might call the college Olympic sports, or the non-revenue sports. I myself being a track and field athlete, former athlete. And perhaps you are aware of and have read the University of North Carolina memo from Bubba Cunningham and Mr. Pogue. And so the question relates to what your perspective, Tom and Val, is of the impact of NIL, the NIL proposal on those what we call college Olympic sports, non-revenue sports, in light of the possible displacement of resources and attention from those sports and from those student athletes, if you think that might happen.
Well, maybe I'll start, Tom. Jill, I would just say in our inquiry, we looked upon this modernization as a positive for Olympic sport and women's sports athletes, especially lower profile athletes who perhaps don't get the television time you see in football or the sport of basketball, that may have identities that transcend athletics, personalities that are marketable and would be of commercial interest to third parties. So in my judgment, I think this is exactly the kind of system that would benefit Olympic sport athletes and again, and women's athletes. So, you know, we would see it as a positive. What I can't really speak to the impact, particularly the impact of the events on the day on athletics budgets, and you know, likely the hard decisions that that athletics directors and our programs are going to be making about the deployment of lesser resources. I can attest that in the Big East Conference, we don't sponsor football in our league. We're basketball centric, so we have different revenue streams than you would see at the FBS level. But this is going to be a hard stretch. I don't think anybody in college athletics can be under any illusions right now about what's ahead of all of us in the next year or two or more in terms of the fallout from what we're dealing with as a public health matter. I would just also note to Representative Gonzalez's comment, I do think it will take some time for this system to shake out. I mean, we're planning to get it going in a year. You know, there are things we don't know. We'll do our best to anticipate the various scenarios, but I think it will take time to see how all of these questions get answered, how these issues unfold. And I suspect we're going to be making adjustments. I don't want to say on the fly, but I think we may end up changing the changes, if you will. In a way that can address not only the issues of the student athletes, and they may have some, but also the needs of our athletics departments, particularly as they continue with the hard work that they have ahead.
And I'll just add to that. I do think our ADs are very concerned about conflicts and displacement, losing income because it goes to the athlete as in turn. And there are other experts who say that some of the athletes have even bigger social media presence in the athletic department. And the two of them should work together because 1 + 1 would equal 3. It would increase the revenues for both. And that's a view. So only time will tell. As far as opportunities go for the Olympic athletes, I think they will be enhanced. We had a call with Google yesterday, and there is going to be great opportunities for these Olympic athletes to gain from the monetization of their NIL rights.
All right, great. Our next questioner is Jacques McClendon.
All right, thank you, everyone. Appreciate everyone from the panel joining me today. Video is not switching over, but I hope y'all can hear me. I think Gabe Feldman made some great points as he started out the conversation about group licensing. As somebody who has got that check from an NCAA video game, getting that post-college, and I look back in my college career, that would have been significant money at the time, right? So I think my question is definitely to Val in terms of thank you for sharing your stance on what the NCAA is and why they prohibit, but is there any chance of revisiting that? And if you did, what would it look like? And also, Tom, thank you for sharing the point, the stance of the athletic directors as well. And, did y'all talk about any viable models that might be able to move that needle forward if that is a direction that would allow a revenue stream for these student athletes to capitalize off their NIL and obviously as well, Mr. Congressman Gonzalez, right? Do you see any legislation that may help a group license deal move forward as well?
Well, thanks, Jock. Maybe I'll just start quickly. The answer to your question is yes. I mean, never say never, right? At this point, though, I would describe group licenses as more of a phase 2 of the NCAA model. As I noted, we felt that the structure of college sports, the fact that the athletes aren't employees, and there's case law to support that, the fact that they're not able to unionize under that current construct, makes a group license model in college sports not something that we could pull off, especially without the possibility of legal risk. And so that's where we are today. It's certainly possible that this idea could come back in another form We would certainly, I think the NCAA, everybody involved in developing the details here would be happy to listen to any potential structure that could make this a possibility. But, I would sort of hope that the forest doesn't get lost for the trees here. The fact is, even without group licenses, athletes are going to have, a significantly increased level of opportunities that they didn't have before. I mean, things are being opened up here that have not existed to date. And so, there will be plenty of chances here for the athletes to take advantage of their NILs. As I noted, there will be opportunities for athletes to come together in groups, be they members of a team, be they colleagues across schools, be they colleagues across campuses, again, with that notation of keeping institutional or conference marks out of it. But there are a whole host of new opportunities here that we would look at as a positive. And it may well be that if you look ahead on the horizon down the road, a year or two or more, particularly if we can get some support at the federal level, it may well be that the group licenses of the kind you described could well become part of the picture down the road.
And I would think some of our ADs believe that group licensing is a way to spread the wealth around to more of their student athletes. And I do think we have to educate our ADs and our members more about some of your concerns, Val. And I do understand the point you made. The question is, can you have a bargaining unit without having it be a union? And again, our ADs are very concerned about that. They don't want to go down the road towards unionization, but are there other ways to do this? So this may be a step 2 issue. It may take one step now and another step later on to really realize this down the road.
Yeah, just quickly, first off, good seeing you, Jacques. It's been a while. But in any event, part of, again, kind of leaning back on this independent oversight group that will have flexibility, another reason why we wanted to go down that route is for this exact issue. So if group licensing is something that makes sense, and I frankly don't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. But if that's a direction that is logical and where everybody wants to go, we want that flexibility to exist, and we want that right to certainly be afforded if appropriate. And so the way we're building our legislation is basically to allow that type of flexibility in there, and potential additions down the road. But the first step, to Tom's point, is to grant the economic right to the individual. And once you grant the economic right to the individual in name, image, and likeness, then you can open it up potentially, down the road to something like group license. And so that's where we're starting there, and then creating enough flexibility into the legislation so that you can add going forward if that's appropriate.
Anthony, great to see you as well, man. Keep up the great work. I think one of the things that I forgot to bring up in my statement as well is a group licensing also would bring up an opportunity, whereas, I'll just throw out a company like Exos who trains individuals, right? It may be another opportunity for a D2 or D3 athlete to maybe, if there was an overarching group license to where they could go and even just hold instructions to instruct, kids or, adults that wanted to get into their sports. So just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that there is value for everyone to maybe capitalize off their NIL with something like that. But I appreciate everyone's thoughts.
All right, great. Christine Copper, you're next with a question.
So Representative Gonzalez, with your athletic background, I appreciate your involvement in proposing federal NIL legislation. And I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on a federal-only approach to NIL, and if federal legislation would require some type of antitrust exemption.
Yeah, great question. In terms of, I'll take the second part first. So in terms of antitrust, we are not granting a blanket antitrust to the NCAA in our legislation for a handful of reasons. One is a very practical one, which is that wouldn't pass. That just would never. That is legislatively impossible right now. I believe. So that's one reason. Second, again, I don't know where I am on that issue personally. It's something I've thought through and kind of come down on both sides of it. So it's not a major priority of mine one way or the other. But legislatively, it truly is impossible. So that's sort of a very practical point. In terms of the federal side and wanting a federal standard versus state by state, I go back to sort of the high school experience and the recruitment experience first. And I think the question is, what is the appropriate methods in which a student athlete should be, or student should be picking a school? And my concern in a state by state model is you get to a world where you have individuals looking at state legislatures and state houses and seeing the status of state legislatures to figure out where they want to go to school, which seems like a very perverse way of choosing an institution. And so, if you get into a federal standard, one, you sort of clean that up for the athlete, and I think you make it simpler. But also, it levels the field for all of college sports. So no matter which state you're in, you play by the same rules, which means, in theory, that you would have equal opportunity inside of that. Obviously, schools are different, right? The marketing rights at certain schools are different from others. That's fine. But in terms of being able to play by the same rules, I think that's very important to maintaining the integrity of the games.
Thank you. I appreciate your athlete-centric views on some of these things.
Thank you.
Hey, if I could follow up on that, you just mentioned that there's no blanket antitrust exemption in the offing, but what about the safe harbor, particularly from NIL, where you could see maybe it trying to descend into play for pay? Is there anything there to protect just the concept of NIL and insulated from being broadened into pay for play?
Yes. So that specifically what you said is what we're looking at right now, Len. And then again, I always caveat everything I say. I haven't said it enough on this call, but with the notion that what I'm doing is putting forth principles and trying to bring a bill forward. It's a negotiation, right? I mean, this bill is not going to look exactly how I want it to, or how anybody on the call would. It will be the product of a lot of back and forth from the different members, and so. The general outlines that I'm describing are sort of where we are and where I think the negotiation is. But at any point, these things can shift one way or the other. But great question. And that's, we're kind of right where you are on that.
All right, thanks. Walt Harrison, you're on.
Thank you, Len. Representative Gonzalez, I think you echo Mark Twain's comment about how legislation is made and how it's like watching sausage being produced. The question I want to ask is to ask you, Representative, if you'd comment on Jacques as a football player. But the question I will ask is to Val to begin with, and then I'd like to hear the other two point of view. The Representative talked very explicitly about an independent commission to oversee NIL rights. The Knight Commission recommended that at least 50% of the members of that commission be independent. That is to say, not representative of colleges, universities, or conferences or the NCAA. Do all of you see that as a possibility and a way to do it? And are there other key elements you'd like to see in oversight of NIL?
So President Harrison, let me maybe start since you did point to me.
Yes.
I think I will just sort of say for the my fellow panelists here in the audience, we're at the front stages right now of trying to figure out the mission, the job description of the oversight entity. How its responsibilities would interface with those of campuses, conference offices, the NCAA AMA staff, and the rules themselves. And so, we kind of can sort out exactly how this is going to work. We can try to turn this into an oiled machine. I'm not sure how well oiled it might be at the beginning, but that would be the goal, to try to synchronize everybody's responsibilities. So we're at the front end of that. My sense, and you would know this as a longtime member of the NCAA governance structure, it might make sense to incubate it at first from within, so that we can make sure that the college presidents, most of all, have oversight over those core principles that we've laid down and that we intend to try to maintain as this is unfolding. But it could well be a step 2 process that we, that it spins off, if you will, and becomes something that is sort of outside of the NCAA. My sense is that at the outset, it could be independent in terms of its operation, but I think you could separate that from the policies under which it's operating. And those, I think, at least at first, may be best, served by being under the oversight of college presidents. And so that, I think we could see some very different models on this. And I think a lot of work will be involved. And that, I think, would be my final thought, is if we're going to get this model up and running by next year, we really don't have a lot of time to set up a structure like this and get it going. But to your point, I do think it's very much something under consideration and could certainly be the right idea, but perhaps not right away.
I wonder if the other 2 panelists have anything to add to that.
I can give a brief sort of comment on it. Of all the pieces of the legislation that we're working on, the independent body is certainly the most nascent, so we're still thinking through it. What I am sensitive to is making sure that it has the right representation of the student athlete, as well as the institutions and the outside groups, whatever they are, the independent bodies or the independent people. And so that's sort of how I'm thinking about it. I just want to make sure that everybody's voice is heard and they're well represented. But I don't have any hard numbers in my head. A third of it has to come from industry, a third athlete, and a third university. I don't have that level of specificity in my head right now. But more about just making sure that everybody's represented appropriately.
And I would say our ADs feel that there's a lot of talent out there that can ascertain whether a deal is being done arm's length, fair market value. That will go a long ways towards, also weeding out bad actors, making sure that you have an instantaneous registrar system. I'm not sure they would be keen on this being under the NCAA. We didn't poll on that. But when we asked the question about student athletes being involved, former, current, only 40% of our ADs were in support of that. So I don't think they'd be opposed to it. I think this is really hiring talent to get a job done. That's my own personal view. And I think that there are very capable folks who can tell you what a social influencer should make, what a certain deal should look like. So I think there is talent out there to get this job done.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you. Right now, we're going to select questions submitted by the audience. For those of you who have questions, and right now I see we've got about 24 out there, but click on the Q&A icon to submit that question. And please note, if your question is for a specific panelist, please let us know that. And if you're a member of the media, please identify your news organization. Amy Perko, our executive director, will read the questions.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, the first question for Val from the NCAA proposal: can student athletes use the same colors without the school mark? For example, a star player at Duke, could they model blue and white and black clothes for Lululemon?
So that's the great question. It's obviously a thorny one because of the obvious association or attempt at association with the university. I would sort of note that in the pro space, the pro leagues have tended to be very protective of their colors. I remember this following my days as a lawyer in-house at the NBA. So I think that's, that's a logical question to ask. And, certainly one that as we get deeper into the details on this one and figure out where the appropriate ways to draw the lines are going to be on that one, again, to make clear that there's a disassociation between the institution and the student athlete. That one, we're going to have to take that on. And again, the question will be whether it's, a hard and fast rule or whether we have to get into the gray, which obviously would be problematic. But at this point, I guess my initial take on that would be that the answer would probably, I'd be leaning closer to no than to yes on that one, Amy.
Thanks, Val. If Gabe Feldman, he's the another panelist. Gabe, if you want to offer your thought on that as well.
Sure, thanks, Amy. I would just say it is a tricky issue. And to me, this gets answered by intellectual property law. This is a trademark law question. And if it violates the institution's trademark, then the principal, certainly of the Knight Commission, would not permit the college athlete to use it. But I don't think we want colleges to have the right to use particular colors to the exclusion of other people. There is, of course, case law on this that if it is the set of colors with other indicia, that may constitute a trademark. But I think that's where the question gets answered. If it is a trademark, it should not be permitted under the principles. If it isn't a trademark, then it can be used by the college athlete, because we want to allow the college athlete to benefit from their identity, but don't have to hide the fact that they are a college athlete. And the Knight Commission would allow the college athlete to identify themselves in an ad as the member of a team or an institution, right? Not to imply an endorsement from the institution. But I think we'd want to allow college athletes up into using the trademark to be able to identify themselves as athletes.
Thanks, Gabe. The next question is from Jason Stock. Obviously we talked about uniformity in the laws across states. Is it also the belief that recommendations should be applied uniformly across Division 1, 2, and 3? And Val, if you can jump in on that, because I think your working group had members of all 3 divisions on it.
Yeah, Amy, that's correct. It was a membership-wide report. And I would say that all 3 divisions landed in the same place in terms of the principles and the framework that was outlined in that report that we put out on April 28th, but it was left to each division to work out details. And that's what's happening now. D1 has, as I mentioned earlier, its own legislative group that's trying to turn this into legislative form. D2 and D3 have their own vehicles to try to get down into the details. And I would say to you, there could well be maybe some variances on this, and I'll give you one example. It may be that one of the other divisions, not D1, may feel more comfortable about some elements of association with the university in the NIL endeavor that we would not feel comfortable with at Division 1, because, as I said, of the recruiting concerns that we articulated. I can't tell you today what all those differences are going to be or would be, but that is in development right now. And, I think as a general matter, all of the divisions will wind up being permissive on this, but you could see some variations in terms of some of the details when it comes to implementation.
Thank you, Val. The next question is from Dennis Dodd with CBS Sports. For Representative Gonzalez, I haven't heard anyone say that Congress has the political will to pass a federal bill overseeing NIL or give an exemption to the NCAA. Where is the interest and really the knowledge on the subject on the Hill right now? And then the second part of that is for Val. If Congress doesn't intervene, Val, how do you see implementation happening with legislation meeting up with at least one state bill ready to go in effect July of 2021, which would be Florida?
Sure, great question. So I'll take the first part. In terms of the interest and the political will, I do think it's there. I'll tell you what is more of a complicating factor right now is just the calendar. Obviously with the coronavirus, that has changed how everybody works across the country. It has also changed significantly how we work in Congress. So, in a normal legislative week, we may vote on 15 bills. Maybe that's a little high, maybe it's 10. We are now in a world where we're voting on maybe 3 bills a month. And so, that is a significant change. And so I think that's probably, from a congressional standpoint, the biggest barrier. But I will say this, I know the Senate is working on it inside, they had the hearing earlier in the year, which I presented at, and they're working closely trying to get to a deal. We are doing so on the House, and from what I can gather, leadership on both sides of the aisle in both chambers knows that this is something that will need to be addressed at some point. And so I think that the will is there. I don't think the will be the problem, I guess is what I should say. I think the much bigger potential hurdle congressionally is the reality of the calendar. And so that's what we're fighting right now, and just trying to make sure that we can elevate this issue and hopefully get it to a place where enough people agree that it's not overly controversial. Believe it or not, there are plenty of bills like that we vote on in Congress. So great question.
Val?
Amy, yeah, I would say, from where we sit, and we're the university presidents who've been involved in this sit, I would say option one would be if there could be a federal action through Representative Gonzalez's work or the work of others, that would be ideal. And even with the strings Representative Gonzalez that would be attached to that, I think everyone goes in with their eyes open that, for example, that oversight component would be there, and so forth. But that would be the first choice. I think, Gabe, we would be, very interested in the work of the Uniform Law Commission as well, because these state laws are different. I think they intend to do the same thing, but there are variations, and they're largely advocating for unrestricted NIL. And that, we think in college sports, there do need to be some limits because of the unique nature of our platform. And so if there could be, I don't know how hard or easy that is, Gabe, only you, I think on this panel could speak to that. But I think that in my mind would be sort of option two, at least to try to create some consistency among the state laws. And if neither of those fail, I'm just not sure I'm the one to articulate what would happen next. I do think it would create a very chaotic environment for sure for our schools. I think it would frankly create the kind of environment that people who care about college sports would not want to see. And so we hope that whatever alternatives that would lead to, don't have to happen. But again, Representative Gonzalez, we appreciate your work and your interest in this, and do hope in the first instance that something could come down that could sort all this out for us and make it easier to, make all of this a uniform framework.
Gabe, do you want to respond on the ULC?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just add a couple of points that to build on what Val and Representative Gonzalez said. The Uniform Law Commission, as I mentioned earlier, did meet. Their committee did meet yesterday, and we had about 50 representatives, including from the NCAA, from agencies, from the National Federation of High Schools, from a very diverse group and former student athletes. And there was unanimous support among those who were involved for some uniform set of laws. And so the committee, and I think it was by a 9-1 vote, voted to move forward with drafting. And that will start in the next few months. And there's one question that the ULC, two questions the ULC considers. One is whether the area would benefit from uniformity. And I think there's pretty large consensus that everyone would, that this industry area would benefit from uniformity. The second was whether we think it's possible to accomplish that, whether the states would be willing to do it. And my answer to that is I think yes, and here's why, and here's the case I made to the Uniform Law Commission. As Val mentioned, we have 37 states who are involved. Most of the legislation, not all of it, but most of it is in the same general category. The fear is that a state wants to get a competitive advantage over another through their NIL laws, and therefore they don't want uniformity. We haven't really seen that happen. We've seen one general model, and most states are adopting that general model. New York is an exception. There's some other exceptions. But I think the states recognize that uniformity is important. And so I think there is an appetite among the states to have a uniform law. The second point is, and again, I raised earlier, the possibility of cooperation between Congress and the states. To have Congress set forward the general framework. These are the minimum protections. but then have the individual states act within that framework to give them some flexibility. And one way that that cooperation can start, and I don't know if there's an appetite in Congress for this, but I think it's a possibility, is if Congress could pass temporary legislation to put a hold on the state efforts, given the timing that Representative Gonzalez mentioned, and the problem with unscrambling the egg. If we get to that point where the state laws do take effect and there are differences across the states, how that impacts all of the issues we've talked about throughout this conversation, that a way to hold off on that, at least to delay it, to call a timeout, is to have Congress say, we're not acting, we're just saying we want to preempt the states temporarily until we have a way to figure out what a solution may be. And maybe the solution is we don't have a solution, states go ahead, but at least give everyone an opportunity to provide a uniform solution.
Thanks, Gabe. We have a couple of questions about Title IX, and Val and Tom, if you want to just comment and just clarify again, several questions just asking again about why Title IX is a concern when schools are not permitted to be involved with NIL deals. Tom or Val?
Well, Amy, it's Val. So, you know, if schools are not involved, then it would seem to me that most of the Title IX concerns would be allayed, because this becomes a market system. It's the market really deciding which athletes it finds appealing, commercially interesting, marketable, et cetera. I think, you know, what's a given is that the equity, if you will, and I think all of our schools do understand this, would be in the level of services that the school would be providing to make sure that all of its athletes have an equitable chance to access NIL activities. So that, you know, I think most of all that's in the educational programming that our schools understand they would be providing. Again, you know, contract basics or how to manage your brand, you know, business related topics that would allow you to responsibly exercise your NIL, because the athletes will be accountable for these endeavors. And so I think the school would understand that, again, to provide those services would be equitable and in conformity with Title IX mandates. But I think once you talk about what the market decides that it would like to do in terms of rewarding these endeavors, I think that's where the Title IX limits would stop. At least that's my interpretation. Others may have a different view, but that's my interpretation of how it would operate.
Great.
Well, I think, as I said, our ADs are very concerned about this. 9 out of 10 are concerned. And that's one of the reasons why they favor a third party. And you know, you can talk about the equitable outcome issue as Val raised right there, which is a reasonable subject to consider. But as the Congressman knows, there's 101 women in the House of Representatives, and they will have a say on this legislation. And if people think that the end result is going to be 95% of it goes to male athletes, you could have some political issues here that will have to be dealt with. This is an underlying concern of our ADs, and the one way I think they can deal with it is by, again, outsourcing the oversight and making sure that there's limited institutional involvement.
Thank you, Tom. Well, I think that will have to be our last question. We've hit our 3:45 mark, so we thank our panelists, and I'll turn it back over to Carol Cartwright for closing remarks.
Thanks, Amy. This does conclude our night commission meeting and discussion. As we noted earlier, if we didn't get to your question, we will be following up with you after the session via email or phone. I want to extend on behalf of all of my colleagues on the commission our thanks to our terrific panelists for their leadership on this critical opportunity for college athletes and on their contributions to deepening our understanding today. And thanks also to our audience for participating.
Thank you.
Thanks.